Good afternoon to all of our guests here in Atlanta and on the web, on the internet worldwide. We are so delighted to have a program today featuring our guests, Julie Bindel and Rachel Moran. Welcome to this amazing conversation with two really of the most courageous and wonderful women I've ever met. They are so brave and so effective at the work that they're doing that we thought at the Carter Center we really needed to have them in a conversation with us, so that all of you who are really worried about the problem of sexual exploitation, human trafficking, prostitution, exploitation of women's bodies and men and boys and girls, anyone who is exploited in the sex trade is really alone in this world, but there are champions that very few people really know about. And so this is our opportunity to really uplift and amplify the voices of two of the world's really the most prominent champions against sexual exploitation. And I just want to do a slight introduction from us at the Carter Center. 3 years ago, President Carter decided that the exploitation of women and girls and the abuse of women and girls was one of the most pervasive, if not the most pervasive, human rights violation on earth. He wrote this book. This is yet another book advertisement. There will be 3 book advertisements today. The audience in the room will get a chance to purchase Julie's book, but I'm going to also introduce Rachel's book. That's very important. But this book by President Carter, Jimmy Carter, Women, Religion, Violence, and Power, really tackles the issue of patriarchy and especially sexual exploitation, where he promoted what was called the Swedish model to end sexual exploitation. And we're going to talk about that today, what that Swedish model, now the abolitionist model, or the equality model, or we've decided maybe the human rights model, or the freedom model. That may be another option for what we might call this approach to ending sexual exploitation. So this is the Carter Center's investment in this work goes back a number of years, and so we're so delighted. So let me get right into it. We have Julie Bindel here with us today, who's an investigative journalist, very brave, has been at work exposing the sex trade, those who are really behind the sex industry, for all of us to learn about. Julie has written really in too many publications to count here, but she's been published in The Guardian, Truthdig, New Statesman, so many publications, so you can look up her work. And Rachel Moran is a survivor leader, author, activist, and her book, get out your pencils, is called Paid For, My Journey Through Exploitation, My Journey Through Prostitution, My Journey Through Prostitution. And her book made me cry and made me wake up and made me so determined to be a voice for this work. And so we're so delighted to have Rachel here today. Just as we were getting ready today for this program, Rachel told me a really wonderful story about how she learned about Julie. Rachel, tell us the story about what it meant to you that you had a journalist who was really getting at the bottom of the issue.
Mm-hmm. Sure, thank you, Karen. So it was around about 9 or 10 years ago, and I had been writing my own book in a very solitary manner. I wasn't connected to this movement at all. And I had told almost nobody about it. I told my best friend, I told my partner, and outside of that, nobody. And I came across the first Julie Bindel article that I ever read. It might have been in The Guardian, where she just told the bald truth about what the sex trade was. And I don't know how many times I said, oh, thank God, to myself in my mind reading this article, because so much, as in almost all of what we read in the mainstream media, is utter drivel and nonsense and pure unreality. And here I was reading this article from a woman who'd never lived the sex trade, but by God, you'd almost imagine she had, because she was telling the absolute truth with such clarity. And it was an enormously it's difficult to find the words. It was healing in a sense to read that in the mainstream media, and I was so grateful. And I had no way of knowing, of course, at the time that some years would go by and we'd end up getting to know each other very well and working together. But yeah, that was my first introduction to Julie Bindel.
Julie, tell us about your journey through this work. And I know you're going to do a reading from your book, but I'd like to at least frame this for us, because I know that you worked on domestic violence and sexual violence for a long time.
Well, first of all, seeing as Rachel's talked about reading my work before we knew each other, many of us in the UK a few years ago were reading Rachel's blog, Free Irish Woman, without knowing who she was, and thinking, this is just too good to be true. Who is this woman? And then, of course, it turned out that Rachel's book was published and we put two and two together, so it meant a lot to abolitionists in the UK. It was a very lonely time. Things are much more vibrant now. And then I received a review copy from Rachel before meeting her of her book, and the rest is history. But I learned about the sex trade from sex trade survivors, so it was their truth that I was relaying, and that's the only way that we can learn the reality of the sex trade. And as Rachel says in her book and in her work and in many public events, you don't hear the bald truth from anyone currently in the sex trade. It's too dangerous to admit that to yourself and to anyone else, really, until you're out. So this nonsense about listen to sex workers, well, we do listen to prostituted women and men, but not the ones that they would perhaps like us to listen to, representing the sex trade from the exploitation point of view, from the 1%, as one of the survivors told me in the book, the unrepresentative, PhD wielding, book author, white, privileged woman or man occasionally. But to answer Karen's question about how I became involved in this issue, particularly against the sex trade, from the very late 70s, early 80s, when I was still in my teens, I met feminists who were working against male violence towards women and girls, and that became my priority. And just over 20 years ago, having worked against, just the usual horrors that we face, domestic violence and homicide, female genital mutilation, rape and sexual assault, child sexual abuse, forced marriage, and all of the other issues that we're aware of, endemic around the world, I decided to focus primarily in my campaigning and in my writing on the sex trade, for the simple reason that it's the worst thing that can happen to a woman. It's the worst. Because all of the other issues that we know that happens, that we're horrified about, all of the other abuses that we face, it's all rolled into one in the sex trade. So I've never met a prostituted woman who hasn't experienced severe domestic violence, child sexual abuse, sexual assault, trauma, physical and mental, and many other violations of her rights and dignity. And so I thought, well, what's the hardest battle that we've got to fight? And it's against the sex trade, for the simple reason that there's money exchanged. It's a business. And because the pimps are very effective in sanitizing the sex trade, in repackaging it and representing it to us as something that is anything other than sexual exploitation. And unlike issues such as rape and domestic violence that women suffer regularly and on a pandemic level, we're not told that this is a choice and that we enjoy it by liberals and leftists and people that should know better. And we're not told that we are the ones whose rights are being protected, that it is about the right for the woman to prostitute, because the man is invisible. If I may read a little extract from the book, one of the chapters is about sanitizing the sex trade. There are many chapters that look at the tactics of the so-called sex workers' rights movement, how they are funded, what they argue, who's behind it, how AIDS and HIV money is used to campaign for blanket decriminalisation, how the academy supports the sex trade. The majority of academics researching this issue are pro-prostitution. and how the sex workers' rights movement, as they refer to themselves, have piggybacked on real campaigns for justice, such as the lesbian and gay rights movement. But I just want to read something about language and about the way that we are force-fed this diet of nonsense about what we know is really the worst kind of exploitation and abuse. And the subheading in this chapter is Sanitizing Use of Language. The most effective way to sanitize any human rights abuse is to rename it. For example, as Janice Raymond points out in her book, Not a Choice, a pro-slavery strategist in the West Indies suggested, instead of slaves, let the Negroes be called assistant planters, and we shall not then hear such violent outcries against the slave trade by pious divines, tender-hearted poetesses, and short-sighted politicians. I mean, it's quite incredible, isn't it, that this is what we're fed with the sex trade all the time. Sex workers, we talk about managers, etc. Language is a powerful weapon in the ideological battle over prostitution. The term sex worker entered popular parlance following the publication of a book, Sex Work, Writings by Women in the Sex Industry, in 1987. Today, in the UK and elsewhere, the term is used by police officers, policymakers, politicians, and human rights organisations. Most media outlets also favour it over the word prostitution. The evolution of sex workers' rights language has had a profound effect on how the sex trade is viewed by the general public. In 2015, I attended the first international conference organised by Prospol, comparing European prostitution policies, understanding scales and cultures of governance, which was held in Vienna, Austria. Delegates have been invited to submit papers under the conference banner, Troubling Prostitution, Exploring Intersections of Sex, Intimacy and Labour. On the flight, I'd read the book of abstract in detail, my eyes growing wider as I ploughed through headings such as Between Love and Work, Negotiations of Economic and Intimate Ties Among Sex Workers and Pimps. These are workshop headings. And The Trafficking of Sex Work, Migration, Working Conditions and Exploitation. At the conference, I attended a number of workshops and keynote speeches that were peppered with the type of euphemisms that serve to distort the reality of the sex trade. For example, contract breach is rape. Business practices, pimping. Facilitate disabled people's sexual lives, disabled men buying sex. These were all in the conference abstracts. Okay, it didn't take me long to work out what they really meant. Occupational health risks means violence, sexually transmitted infections, and rape. Job amenities, the ability to turn down undesirable clients. Effective erotic services performed by prostitutes, sex acts. Third parties, pimps. Sex work management, running a brothel and or a woman. Grooming gangs, pimps who target girls under the age of 18. And international marriage community, mail order brides. Coerce, victim, trafficking and survivor were put in scare quotes in the conference materials. Millions of dollars were poured into anti-trafficking initiatives, but the problem did not abate. This is what they were arguing at the conference, that trafficking is an invention by feminists, Christians, moralists, and that in fact what it is sex work, migration for sex work, with one academic even arguing that the women from the Philippines in brothels in the UK were not debt bonded, not at all. They just didn't understand the conversion rate from their own currency. Okay. I just wanted Rachel to read an extract looking at the reality for the women. For this book, I interviewed 50 sex trade survivors and also a number of other people involved in the sex trade, from pimps under legalisation, Johns, in legal and illegal brothels, lobbyists, campaigners against HIV, I mean, a whole range of people. And of course, the truth tellers are the sex trade survivors, and this is where we get the real information from.
I love the humbleness of your nature, Julie, when you say that you interviewed some other people. There was 200 other people interviewed aside from the survivors in this book.
It was a long job.
It was. Okay, so the pro-prostitution lobby rarely speaks about regular prostitution, where a buyer hands over cash to a woman in order to gain access to the inside of her body for one-sided pleasure. Nor do they speak about the actual sex. I have only ever heard survivors, or those still in prostitution but wishing to get out, talk about what the sex is like in reality. Unlike the pro-prostitution lobby, whose members speak of safe sex, the other women I have interviewed recount the detail. They speak of the horrendous smell of the punters and the pain of a dry, bruised vagina being penetrated by multiple men, the horror of having his semen or other bodily fluids anywhere near her face, his beard rubbing her cheek until she bleeds. They tell me about how their necks get sore from whipping their head away from his tongue as he tries to kiss her, about being unable to eat or drink or kiss her children because of what she has had to do with her mouth, how her arm and elbow aches from desperately trying to get them to ejaculate so that she does not have to be penetrated one more time. Now, this is the actual reality of prostituted sex. And I mean, I'll go on a short little roll about some ideas and feelings I have about all of this, because I think there's a very basic problem here that we're not dealing with. A really basic. I think what we've done is we've skipped step one and continued on the conversation from beyond that point. And I mean all of us in society, because we're trying to figure out when we're interested in this issue, you know, if we're actually even-handed, open-minded academics, let's say, and there's very few of them out there. But they're trying to figure out what prostitution is before they figured out what sex is. And I think that that's the step that we're missing. In my view, sex is the most intimate mode of communication that exists. And when you're having wanted sex, you're communicating a very, very different message. And when you're having unwanted sex, and I'm talking about in that dynamic, in that exchange, if you're a man in a brothel and you're inflicting unwanted sex on a woman, rather than communicating, I adore you, which is what generally we do when we're having wanted sex, you're communicating, I despise you. And you're doing it in the most intimate, imaginable way. And that is where the psychological harm resides. And that is why we can never make this safe, because it's inherently unsafe in the core of itself. I must write a little more about that. There you go.
And I'd like both of you to answer this question, because I think it gets to the heart of this. Why do you think the pro-prostitution lobby has been successful? I have had many discussions with people, and I find most people uninformed, really uneducated about what's going on, and many well-meaning people thinking that it's a good liberal progressive position to be pro-legalization or pro-decriminalization. Can you both talk about that? Why do you think this is so embedded in our consciousness? Start with you, Julie.
The reason why I wanted to write this book was that because everywhere I went in the world, as a journalist, a feminist campaigner, whoever I talked to about the sex trade, who weren't involved in it, who knew nothing about it whatsoever, always had a strong opinion and always had the answer. And the answer was, in the main, legalise it. Let's make it safer for the girls. And if I had £1 for every time I've heard that, we would never be short of funding for the women's movement again. Right? So I wondered about why there was so much certainty. Because if I went to somebody and said, how do you think that we could alleviate famine and poverty in West Africa? Unless people were actually involved in that, they would say, oh, I'm not sure, I don't know. I mean, you know, who knows? But everybody had an opinion about this, and it was always the default position. And, of course, it was because the message is so persuasive from the pro-sex trade lobby, because they have a vested interest, because it's money. It's money, money, money. But there are also the ideologues who aren't making money from this necessarily, but they think that they're really cool and hip, and that to be anti-prostitution is to be anti-sex. And the academics, of course, that churn out their propaganda, calling it research, that hang out with the sex workers, that get a bit native, that do their anthropological research, they hang out with the privileged few who are the totally unrepresentative, tiny fraction of the movement. But I have to say that before we get too gloomy about this, there's one figure, because I don't deal with statistics in this book. I'm a journalist and not a statistician, and we can't know about numbers except for how legalization triples illegal brothels, etc. But one thing that we really should be very optimistic about is that we have the abolitionist model, where the sex buyer is criminalized, the prostituted person is decriminalized, and there are support services for exiting. We have that in more countries than we have legalization. So we are winning, and we are persuading governments that you cannot possibly legalize, as Rachel has said, or decriminalize, which is the same thing. And then finally, the message that's persuasive about how sex work is a choice for the women, it's much more palatable to believe that. Because if we didn't believe that, we'd have to look across the breakfast table at men that we love, men that we respect, men that we work with, and know that this is something that they are doing to women, that they are committing acts of paid rape, and that they can dehumanize a woman to the point of where he rents the inside of her body for one-sided sexual pleasure. And it's absolutely horrendous to get to know that, but once you know it, you can't unknow it.
I really think so too. I think that women are frightened. Women are frightened to acknowledge the scale of the problem. There's a lot of figures been bandied about. One that I've heard over and over is a rough estimate of about 40 million women and girls across the planet in systems of prostitution. Even if it's a fraction of that size, which it isn't. But let's imagine it was only a small fraction of that. Let's say we were talking about 4 million. That's a horror show. It's a horror story. And we don't want to face that as a people, as a species. We don't want to take a good look at what's the scale of the damage and the harm. When I walk through the streets of Amsterdam, I'm absolutely amazed by the fact that they have a statue, a brass statue, which they call, I think it's the golden sex worker.
Bell.
Right. And then they have a brass breast in the middle of the footpath, very large brass breast, a couple of feet across. And then mauling this brass breast and taking photographs of each other. It's a tourist attraction. We're at the point in the world where our abuse is entertainment for men. And women are frightened to look at the scale of this tragedy. And this system is all the time building and growing, and certainly in these regions of the world where they decriminalize/legalize. And as Julie says, it's exactly the same thing. And the nonsense of trying to pretend that they're different is really, really silly. I mean, what I see all the time coming from our political opponents is this unreality, this constant Orwellian unreality that they're trying to feed us. And wrapping the whole issue up in layers of unnecessary complexity when in reality it's very simple. Because if any one of us arrived home in our house today, for example, and found that it had been burglarized and everything we owned had been stolen, and you get down to the courtroom and that person walks out the door and you get none of your stuff back, reason being burglarizing the houses has suddenly been either legalized or decriminalized, does it matter a damn to you what the term is? Do you know what I mean? If I like to think in and speak in analogies a lot. because I think you can really simplify and clarify matters when you do that. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter a damn whether this horror show was decriminalized or legalized, because it produces the same result.
On this issue, I think, people sometimes will say to me, well, like with drugs, if you decriminalize, at least decriminalize, because they try to make this distinction. Well, legalization is an elaborate system of regulation where you have rules and you have structures to monitor. That's legalization. And then they say, well, decriminalization is different because really you're just you're not arresting people, and so it's more of a passive policy. Now, so on the drug, in terms of the drug war, there's a very strong argument for decriminalization because it does feed the organized crime. It feeds, So I find people making this equivalency all the time. So how would you respond to people who say this? And also, what's been so hard, and I just have to say this, meeting Rachel and Julie, and there are another number of people in the room today who are also part of what I would say is a newish movement, the survivors movement. This is what's so important to understand. For 20, 30 years, the sex trade has been at it, arguing for legalization, right? But really in recent years, what you've had emerge is Rachel and others who are in the room today, Vanita Carter back there have been some really amazing women, survivors, coming forward and saying, you know what, no. This doesn't work. It's violent, inherently violent, and we're going to speak up, but they are really on their own. All of the other mainstream human rights organizations have gone for the pro-prostitution argument. So explain why people who say decriminalization is like decriminalizing drugs, why that doesn't work, and why do you think the big human rights organizations have gone for the other argument? Julie first.
Well,
and then
I'll
Rachel.
deal with the drugs issue first, very simply. Drugs are inanimate objects and women aren't. So that's one thing. And the politics of inevitability around this is the most pessimistic set of politics I've ever heard. We've always had a sex trade. There'll always be women wanting to do it. There'll always be men wanting to buy. So let's just make it safer. Well, we don't say that about child sexual abuse, do we? We don't say it about racism. We don't say it about poverty. We say we want to end this. But when you say you want to eradicate the sex trade, it's like, whoa, I've had people laugh in my face. People who should know better. Because they just consider, and it's a class as well as a race issue with a horrendous dollop of misogyny. Because there is a belief, even from liberal leftist men and some women, that there is a subgroup of women for whom this is just what they're there for. There's also this crazy notion that if men don't get sex when they want, with whom they want, how they want, that they will have to go out and rape a real woman, which is what sex buyers have said to me more than one, a real woman. So feminists don't have this idea of men. We think that boys are born babies and then socialized into the patriarchal system under which we live. We don't think that men are potential rapists. They do, though. Sex buyers do. So the drugs argument is nonsense. The human rights argument, however, is both complex and simple at the same time. It is about money, because George Soros's money and Bill and Melinda Gates' money is usually involved somehow, and they think that they're doing this in the fight against HIV and AIDS to lobby for decriminalisation. Oh, great. So you increase the number of sex buyers. That's a really good way, isn't it, to make sure that rates of HIV fall. But the money keeps being poured into these organisations to campaign for decriminalisation because the HIV and AIDS community say that if you decriminalise pimps and brothel owners and sex buyers, somehow there'll be 100% condom use. Somehow there'll be no violence towards the women in prostitution.
It's an absolute nonsense. I'm sorry for cutting across you, Julie, but I get so angry with that argument. But I truly believe that if Bill and Melinda Gates looked at the harm and the damage that their money is doing, I absolutely don't believe that they would continue to perpetuate that. But they need to really look, and they need to listen to those of us who've lived this issue. I never came across a woman who told me, like Sabrina is a perfect example. So Sabrina Valise, one of our newest representatives in Space International, never found herself bullied into having condomless sex until decriminalisation. And she spent years of her life while she was in prostitution in New Zealand pressing for decriminalisation. So she's had to do that very painful, very soul-searching public U-turn politically because of the harm and the damage. And she said to me, both privately and publicly, that she actually feels a sense of accountability, that because she fought for full decrim, she's now obliged to fight to stop it spreading. And I have so much respect for women who step out and do that. But just a quick point I wanted to make, Karen, on the nature of our history as a movement. The survivors' wing of the abolitionist movement actually dates back at least 30 years. But what the women who were advocating 20, 25, 30 years ago were dealing with was a situation where they were very spread out all across the globe. There were very few of them relative to today. And of course, we didn't have the internet back then, so women weren't joined up in the way they are today. And what we've seen, I'd say, especially in the last 5 or 6 years, is an escalation in the amount of women who are willing to speak out. And I think what's happening is we're drawing courage from each other. Like when we first put on a public event for politicians in Ireland back in 2012, I was so comforted and delighted to have Fiona Broadfoot come over from England. She'd been 20 odd years doing the same work in England. So this is what's happening now, is that we're starting to support each other and join ranks, and we've become truly global now as a movement.
So I think when I say new movement, I think this is the part that I'm talking about, is the coming together, and that you have all been working in such a lonely way for so many years. I think that has to be acknowledged. I also just want to say, I think it's really important, if anyone from Open Society or Soros or Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation are listening, these institutions have done amazingly good work in so many fields, in democracy and human rights and in health. They've done such great work. And I think that if they knew, I really do, I want to believe that if those who are really in charge of these programs really understood the issues, I want to believe we could persuade them to change their tactics. I want to be optimistic, because I think we have to persuade those who really do have the best intentions and the best, let's just say, the best will in their hearts for well-being, that I do think it's a misguided understanding. And I think it's so important because, and I'm not trying to take away what you're saying, either of you, please don't misread me, because I think it's true as it stands today. But I think all of us can, and it's the same with Amnesty International. What an amazing organization, has done so much for so many people over decades. Yet on this issue, they're just wrong.
Yeah.
And so I think I want to separate all the great work those organizations have done from this issue. It's hard to do because you're implicated. If your money is going into something that's so harmful, then you're implicated. But I guess I'm trying to issue a challenge here to get it right.
Saying, Karen, and I take your point, and I think one of the wonderful things about us as humans, and one of the things that keeps me going, is that we all have the capacity to change our minds. I mean, if that wasn't true, we may as well just shut up and go home,
right.
Because nothing we said would make any difference.
Yeah.
I also agree. I think my personal view about the male-led human rights mainstream organisations is that it's based on paternal self-interest, and the kind of right that men believe that they have to pay for sex, which they don't consider, good men don't consider that they have a right to beat their partners or abuse their children. But these same men do actually believe that this is a right that they have. But what they do is they hold up the prostituted woman as a human shield for their arguments. They say this is her right. This is her right to choose. This is feminism. How can you tell a woman that she can't consent to doing this? And it's not feminism at all. It's neoliberal individual politics. And they have the spokespeople that represent these neoliberal arguments as the atypical people, that really are so atypical. It would be like finding a 30-year-old African-American man living in this city who said he has never experienced 1 ounce of racism or white supremacy in his life. I am sure that if we dug hard enough, we could find that man. We may or may not believe him if he says this, but he should not represent Black Lives Matter. Am I right? Right? So the problem that we have, and this is a bigger problem than any of us understand, I think, and certainly a bigger one than I recognised before I did the research, is the HIV and AIDS prevention world and scientific community. I went to the Vancouver World AIDS Conference in 2015 to look properly at this issue because the previous year, The Lancet, which is one of the most prestigious publications in the world, published a special edition that was funded by, and I'm almost certain it was Bill and Melinda Gates, it may have been Soros. Either way, the special edition was funded, and it was put together by a pro-prostitution scientist who found who put 7 articles together, all arguing that if you implement blanket decriminalisation of every aspect of the sex trade around the world, within 10 years you will have a drop in new HIV infections of between 36 and 44%, right? And now, trust me when I tell you I'm no scientist or mathematician, but reading these articles and then bouncing them off someone who is a researcher and scientist and expert in AIDS and HIV, I realised that there were more holes than a Swiss cheese in these arguments. And it was perfect for us because these were the best of the bunch, the creme de la creme. Every single expert in this issue had contributed to those 7 articles. And it was just nonsense. It was, as I explained before, the argument that you would have 100% condom use, that women would access services, that services would just magically appear, that there would be no police brutality, that there would be no rapes and violence in prostitution. How does swelling the numbers in the sex trade, which is what happens under decriminalisation, would help reduce HIV? Absolute nonsense. Now, that was ideologically led. These scientists believe this. That the entire world read newspapers from tabloid red tops through to, the New York Times. Legalising the sex trade would eliminate AIDS. I mean, this is how people get the message.
It's just so frustrating. It's mind-blowing. Julie and I went to Melbourne last spring, and given we were so close by, we said to each other, well, we're going to have to go to New Zealand and check this out with our own eyes. So we did that, and we spent time with an outreach worker who'd worked for 16 years. And what she told us was, so she would have started working on the issue about 2 or 3 years before decriminalisation was passed back in 2003. And what she said was that within 6 months of decrim, within 6 months, the increase was visible on the streets. And in the years that had passed, she had gone from dealing with 6 to 8 women in that zone to dealing with 50 to 60. So you're talking about a massive expansion. And it's only common sense, because you give the green light to every man in a nation, go for it, then the demand increases. So as soon as the demand increases, and then your supply is increasing. And what drives me wild is that we look at this issue, we recognize it to be in one of its elements in industry, right? And we don't apply the very same common economic logic to it that we do to any other industry. Now, what is that about? The streets of Auckland are heaving and teeming with young Maori girls, young women of all descriptions, but you couldn't help but notice that there was an obvious overrepresentation of young Maori girls, and that's the same as it is everywhere, because what we have in this system is it's misogyny at its core, and it has all of the added elements and ingredients of racism and every kind of negativity you can imagine is mixed up in this cocktail. And this is why I get so enormously annoyed with these people who look at this and can't see what should be so obvious. So I would invite Bill and Melinda Gates to take a drive down K Road in Auckland, for starters, and take a look at what it is that they are pouring millions into promoting.
Yes, this is it's we have a big job of education to do on this matter, because I do think the public health field is very, very large and influential, and has again done so much great work in crises of public health. But on this issue, there is this very short-sighted and wrong interpretation of what actually is effective, what are effective strategies. So we only have about 15 minutes left, and I'm hoping that some people will be able to ask a couple of questions. If you do, raise your hand, because I'm going to keep the conversation going unless I see hands raising. I'm going to call on you first, but before then, Rachel, if you were to, right now we're in the United States, we're here in an American city. Atlanta is known for being a hub for sex trafficking and prostitution, strip clubs. I used to live in a neighborhood where there was just lines and lines of strip clubs. So what should Americans be aware of? What are the opportunities and the risks in the US that you've learned in all of your trips and your visits to survivor leaders and various conferences and events here in the US that you think we should be paying attention to?
Well, we're pushing for the model of legislation where people in prostitution are decriminalized. That is on the understanding that nobody ought to be criminalized for their own exploitation. That's fairly basic, and that's what needs to happen. And it needs to happen in conjunction with the exploiters, be they financial or sexual, so pimps or johns. They need to be heavily criminalized for what it is that they're doing. And we also need to open up pathways, exit strategies for everybody involved in prostitution, so that they have the help and support they need to go on and rebuild their lives. I was very lucky in Ireland in that when I got out of prostitution in '98, I was able to go back to education in the millennium year. So I spent about 2 years licking my wounds and trying to orientate myself and figure out how to move on in my life. And I was very lucky that I lived within a structure of a society that basically was set up to give people second chances. We'd had a lot of money come into the country through the Celtic Tiger years. And I was able to make my way out of prostitution because of the setup of our nation. But we need to provide those same kind of supports to prostituted people everywhere. And I absolutely guarantee you give women real other viable options so that they can find a different way to pay their bills and feed their kids, and your red light zones are going to be ghost towns in short order.
It's so interesting, because imagine if all the money going into this sort of so-called harm mitigation public health strategy were going into exit services. Right. So this would be, this is an opportunity to really put the challenge. If we want to end HIV/AIDS, if we want to help vulnerable people, why not take those billions and prioritize exit services? Now, the legislative framework is extremely important, because criminalizing, criminalizing women or people, women and men, boys and girls who are trapped, who are taken into the sex trade, trapped and brought into the sex trade, that is not what we should be doing. No. Somebody mentioned yesterday, I think it was Gregoire, who one of our guests from France, who was crucial in the movement to promote this model in France recently, that in the US what we have is a prohibitionist model. There's prohibition really in the US, and that's not sustainable, because it happens under the radar, it happens in the way it does. So either the pro-legalization movement will win, or the human rights approach, what we call the real human rights model, will win. Those are the two possibilities. So I think this is what you're saying, is like, we've got to get the legal framework straight. So decriminalize people in prostitution, criminalize buyers, most importantly, because it's demand that this business is built around. It's demand. So criminalize the buyers and, of course, the pimps. But the exit services, if we could get the UN, the Gates Foundation, Open Society, Amnesty International, all of these important organizations to focus on exit and care services, what a world that would be. Conversely, if we legalize, I always do this math in my head. If we legalize, every 10, 11-year-old, 12-year-old boy will grow up thinking it's like drinking a beer, right? You sneak a beer. or a joint. And imagine, just do the numbers. Imagine how many human bodies will be required to fill the supply chain.
That's a really good point, and I remember one of my many trips to the Netherlands during the research of this book, and prior to that, I was with a sex trade survivor who's been mentioned, Fiona Broadfoot from the UK, and we were wanting to interview Johns in the Windsor brothel area. And the other thing, of course, that happens under legalisation is sex tourism is massive. It's huge, and let's be honest, this is definitely the impetus for the government to pull in some money from that. And we saw a young man, he was probably in his early 20s, leaning by one of the window brothels, smoking, waiting for his friend to come out, who was inside buying a woman. And he agreed to be interviewed, and he told us that he first paid for sex when he was 12. And he said, but it's normal here, it's fine here, it's legal, it's not in your country, it's not in America, but it's legal here. And that is the attitude we're talking about. And that boy, of course, had been told by his father it was fine. And as Fiona pointed out, that was child abuse. But it wasn't the woman who was the abuser. It was the culture that supports the system of prostitution. And then I've interviewed young people in Sweden, where they were the first country in 1999 to pass the abolitionist law. And those boys and girls are growing up seeing prostitution as unacceptable, as a human rights violation, and as part of violence against women and girls. And it makes for a far better society. And it's a question that we need to ask. What sort of a world do we want to live in? Why do we say we can't end the sex trade? Of course we can end the sex trade. And of course we'll be the ones to win. We're not going to legalise. It's been a disaster everywhere. We cannot let it happen.
The idea, I think, that we frame legislation around the belief that prostitution cannot and will not be eradicated, I would call that a philosophy of despair.
Absolutely.
That's exactly what it is, and I think that we have really got to look at, like, I'm a mother, my son is 23, and the idea of him growing up in that culture, because do you remember that young man also said to you, Julie, that it was a situation among the young men where if you hit your mid-teens and you hadn't yet bought your way out of your virginity, well then the first question was, what's up with you, are you gay? Right. So you had to prove your masculinity by exploiting a woman. Now when we really think about that, what we're dealing with at that level, we are breeding predators. We are, with the society itself is demanding of our young boys that they be sexually predatory, otherwise they will be at odds with their peer group. And then we're surprised when they grow up to be violent, abusive adult males. So there's a real deep conversation to be had here. We really need to wake up.
Yes, and I'm so grateful because these women, and there are men also in the movement, we have some here who are super important to us. This is a very optimistic way to end before we go to questions. It is optimistic because we have to win. We can't allow it. I'd like to introduce Diane Doherty. Would you have a question? And speak loud because there are no microphones.
I have a question. Most of it was answered with this last conversation, but I have a question for you, and it has to do with your own fear of stepping out on your own. How did you do that? I think of a young girl who has been put in the industry, but doesn't want to be there. What is it that we can do for our young girls to help them step out earlier?
Do you mean out of prostitution?
Out of prostitution earlier.
Well, I think that...
Rachel, can you repeat the question because the audience, the online audience.
Sure. The question was, what can we do? What can we put in place to help women and girls out of prostitution earlier? Well, I think a very, very important element to this has got to be preventative, because we need to stop them going in the first place. And that, of course, is the model that I've just spoken about, because what happens under that model is that the sex trade shrinks, demand shrinks, the trade itself shrinks. And the normative qualities of the model that we've talked about earlier also create the kind of society where prostitution is not tolerated amongst the male peer group. So what's really interesting now in Sweden, they've had that law since '99. So they're heading on for 20 years. It's been 18 years now. So young men who are in their early 20s now in Sweden have been raised their entire lives in a society that frowns heavily upon sex buying. So the practice of sex buying now is understood to be something that only a loser would do. That's the term that they use. So this is what I mean when I say preventative and normative. That's what we've really got to be looking at. And as far as getting women out of the sex trade earlier, those who are in the sex trade, we need to give them all of the options. And we need help with housing, with education, with training, with addiction services, with childcare, with all of the things that a woman needs. When I went back to school, I was able to get supports for it. Now, it was around education. I never told anybody I'd been in prostitution. They weren't targeted exit strategies that I was accessing, but I was able to get enough support from the state that I was able to get up on my feet and move on with my life. And we absolutely have got to provide that for women. Now, if there's a sprinkling of women who are happy as Larry in the brothel and don't want to access these services, well, that's their business. I'm not saying we need to be dragging women out of brothels here. What I'm saying is we need to give women real viable other options, because the minute we do that, the sex trade will dissolve all by itself.
Yes.
Thank you so much for the work that you're doing, and I really resonate with what you're saying, and I keep thinking to myself, we don't have those exit strategies yet, we don't have any of these supports in place, and for so many women, that is truly the only way that they can make enough money. You know, they could work at McDonald's, or they could, you know, make more money in the sex trade. And when you meet a woman who believes that this is her choice, and I'm not talking about 1 to 1%, I'm just saying somebody who believes that this is her exercise of agency and autonomy, and that she will not be able to support herself in this way if this is, quote, taken away. I'd love to hear a little bit about how those conversations go.
May I say something? Well, I've met many women who tell me that it's their choice. And the only way that I can think about it is, because we're not about taking choices away from women, we're about actually taking a stand against horrendous abuse and the rights of men. That's what we're taking a stand against, the rights of men to sexually access women when cash is involved. In other words, whether women are not consenting. But the analogy that I always use is a poor, desperate man, maybe in the Congo, trying to get his family over to Europe or the US, who has no means for travel. He fears for his life and the life of his children. He can't feed them, so he sells a kidney. Well, that's his choice. Somebody needs the kidney. Somebody's prepared to pay for the kidney. Who are you to say that he shouldn't sell his kidney? How dare you say that he should stay and be killed, starve, have his children go hungry? Well, we don't take that attitude, do we? We say that the organ trade is vile, that the surgeon who performs the operation should be criminalised, that the person who wishes to buy the kidney should be criminalised, and that the market should be completely eradicated, because there should be no market in the human body. And so it's not about taking the choice away from the man who wishes to sell his kidney, or the woman who really is happy as Larry, as Rachel puts it, in the brothel. It's about stopping the exploiters from driving this demand and from being the third-party exploiters and sex buyers. So let's leave the woman out of it. We're not taking away any agency or power that she might have or believe she has, because she is not to blame. And this is why women are always held up as human shields. It's about her choice and her agency. No, it's not. It's about the man's choice. And that's what we're really arguing. So I never argue with the women that it's not her choice.
Another point to make is that I gave an interview, only ever one, when I was in the sex trade myself. And the journalist asked me a string of questions and I gave her a string of lies. Now, I'm not suggesting that every woman who has ever given an interview who's in the sex trade is lying. But what I am telling you is that I lied because I was not capable of telling the truth. Because if I had to have a situation where I honestly answered her questions, like she said to me, for example, don't you care what people think of you when you're standing there on the street? I was 17 at the time, so I was still on the street. And I told her, excuse my language, in our Irish parlance, I says, no, I couldn't give a shite, you know. And it was all defense. It was pure defense, because I couldn't possibly say yes every time that car drives by and somebody looks at me like I'm in on the other side of an aquarium pane of glass or the bars of a zoo. I feel my soul wither. I couldn't say that and go back and stand on the corner. Right. So you have to understand that there are layers and layers of unreality going on here, and stuff that women find very, very hard to face. And it took me a long time to be able first to face it and then to articulate it. And I wasn't in no position to do that when I was in prostitution.
We have 2 more questions, and then we're going to wrap up. Nancy and then Jolie.
It's just an observation. Thank you very much for your very important and timely discussion. I just want to, you mentioned, Judy, that men in sex trafficking are invisible, unfortunately. And I mean, if you just look at the room, you will see that also men in prevention are also almost invisible. I apologize for men who are here tonight. And I think, you know, I mean, men need to be made aware of how important of an ally they are. You know, it's not a woman's issue. It's actually mostly a men's issue.
Right. Let me just take Jolie's question first, and you can do both of them. Go ahead.
Thank you for being here, especially Rachel for staying out here. I want to get your thoughts, both of your thoughts, on why the Nordic model doesn't include an armed behavior change campaign around the stigma against people in prostitution.
I'll just briefly kick in that I think that what we need to be doing with the stigma of prostitution is pointing it in the other direction. We shouldn't be eradicating the stigma of prostitution. We should be directing it back where it belongs. The problem is not the stigma, it's the direction it's pointed in.
You mean to the men?
To the men.
To the buyers?
And the women, what's really interesting, and that's a very good question that you've asked, what's really interesting from the many women we've spoken to who were prostituted under legalisation and decriminalisation is how the stigma does not diminish one bit for them at all. Yeah, at all. And it's a really interesting point as well about the public education campaigns, because they've been invaluable in the countries where this model has been introduced. You can't just introduce a new law and expect people to understand it, like stopping smoking in public buildings. In my country, we had years of build-up to that, where we had to really, it's a bit like the sex trade, because you had to challenge the orthodoxy and the fake research of the tobacco industry in order to get the truth across to people about the harms.
So I think this is important because in the countries that have gone with this, what was called the Nordic model, now you've heard it mentioned as the abolitionist model, the public education is part of it. And the part of it in Sweden, as Rachel mentioned, is that then men who buy become losers or whatever. She's talking about shifting the stigma to the act of buying, not to particular men. We have another guest with us, Peter Qualiatine, who works with men who've been who've bought prostituted women, and they work to rehabilitate men. So there is that part of it, bringing men into the recovery aspect of it. There are some groups that do that. It's very important work. So I agree with you that there is that helping men come out of it. But, you know, we stigmatize murder. We stigmatize child abuse. There's a stigma to it because you want a deterrent in society against a horrific act. And this is no different. We should, this is, I think, what you're meaning, Rachel, right? Is that the act itself should be stigmatized. Yes. Not that you want to condemn any particular man to forever, you know, the hell and turn. Okay.
Yeah, what I'm saying is that prostitution, to be as direct as I can be, and I've said this publicly many times, prostitution is stigmatized for damn good reason. It's stigmatized because it's damaging and because it's harmful. And we all understand that on a sensory level. I mean, we very often don't understand it on an intellectual level, but we certainly understand it on a gut level because we don't want our own loved ones in a brothel. Now that's a sensory understanding of what the sex trade is. And we've stigmatized the sex trade, I believe, in response to that sensory understanding. But the mistake that we've made is in stigmatizing the exploited instead of the exploiters. And that's the change that needs to happen.
And yeah, exactly. And Nancy's question about getting men involved, we've talked about it a little bit here, but is there anything else you'd like to say about men's contribution?
Well, I think men know fine well what they need to do. But the problem is that with a few notable exceptions, all men benefit from the system of prostitution. All men. But not all men pay for sex. And there are some men, thankfully, that don't wish to benefit from prostitution and that fight to eradicate the sex trade. But very, very few. Very, very few. And so the last thing that we need to do as feminists with our hands full, trying to end the patriarchy, which is quite a job, is to have to be nannies to men who already know that this is their job, to tell their friends, don't rape, don't pay for sex, don't abuse your partner, and to not do it themselves. You know, we could end rape tomorrow if men just chose not to rape. It would be so straightforward, so men know fine well what needs to be done.
And lastly, Rachel said to me one time that, this is a whole other roundtable topic, but I think we have to mention it, that pornography is, Rachel once said to me, pornography is just prostitution with a camera in the room. And so, but pornography is so normalized, so many people are engaging in it, it's become so violent. As Gail Dines, the expert on this topic, says, this is not your father's Playboy, magazine. That by using pornography, and which is mostly men, they are contributing to the sex industry. And this is one thing that men need to be challenged on and do something about by A, not using porn, but also speaking up against it, making sure their young boys don't use it, their young sons, etc. So that's also something. Before we end, is there anything we'd like to conclude with? And then we'll please stay and buy Julie's book. And if you can't do it today, buy it online. And you'll definitely want Rachel's book paid for, My Journey Through Prostitution. And of course, if you don't have this book yet, President Carter's book, A Call to Action, Women, Religion, Violence, and Power. Those are 3 book assignments for us. Any last words?
Very briefly, we can and we will end the sex trade. And the straightforward reason is that we know, if we look at the history of the women's liberation movement, and we look at all civil rights movements, is that this movement is built on the testimonies and then action of the survivors within this movement. And I don't mean wheeling women out who've been prostituted to speak about their rape and torture and terror. We know these stories, right? It's almost one story. But I mean as experts who will tell you about the punters, the Johns, the police. They'll tell you about the brothels, about the legislation that we need, about policy, about exiting services. We need to listen to the women and not ask women for their stories of horror, but ask women about their stories for a solution.
Much. And come get your copy of, do you have to put the book up so that everyone can see the cover, because it's such a good cover, The Pimping of Prostitution. Please come and pick up your book, and online, you can order it online, of course, so please do. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Karen.
Thank you.